Hello and welcome to the Critical Move Hotel Sur. Despite the new ceasefire on the Donbass front line agreed between Kiev and Moscow since July 27th, tension remains in the eastern Ukraine. What factors have influenced these intermittent disturbances to the peace? What are the loose ends of the Ukrainian conflict? What strategic interests are there in the area? Let's deploy the board. We're making the first move. The media reported that 2 days before the start, the Ukrainian armed forces violated the ceasefire agreed following a call by Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who stressed the importance of implementing the agreements at the peace summit held last December in Paris. The enemy opened fire with small arms and heavy machine guns on the 36th unit of the Marine Brigade. No casualties were reported among Ukrainian troops. The joint forces have not recorded any losses. Our units remain calm. The shooting that occurred during the night did not cause any damage to the soldiers on the front line. The armed forces of Ukraine continue to defend the country from Russian aggression. For the 7th consecutive year, we are ready to give an immediate response to the occupying forces. To comply with the decision of the highest state leadership, the joint forces have to maintain the ceasefire under the same conditions applied to the enemy. The fulfillment on the security component will open the way to a political solution to the conflict. It is clear that military unrest is not the solution. We need military and diplomatic tools. No one can prohibit soldiers from defending themselves against the enemy in case of clear enemy aggression. It is covered by international humanitarian law. As head of the joint forces, I must ensure that if the enemy violates the ceasefire or causes danger to the health or lives of our soldiers, our response will be immediate and strong. 20 minutes after the ceasefire took effect, there were shootings. The ceasefire was violated. When can we believe in Putin's ceasefire? There have been many already, but they are not really a ceasefire. I don't like that our army is dismantled, that it no longer has intelligent units. We're like blind cats at a time when the separatists and Russian troops can shoot like they used to. To be honest, I don't believe in the ceasefire. This isn't the first ceasefire we've seen, and there's very little chance of anything changing. In these pandemic circumstances, it is difficult. However, we have spoken to Germany, France, and the other parties, all support the idea of meeting in the Normandy format when COVID-19 declines. The Minsk format is the priority, but no one should cancel the other formats. I'm ready for any kind of format that can bring us closer to the end of war and recover our territory and our people. Any format, I don't care. We need results. Russia has agreed to additional measures to strengthen the ceasefire that came into effect on July 27 at Donbass. Moscow supports the agreement aimed at preserving lives and infrastructure first and foremost, as well as providing information on the truce on the line of confrontation. However, there are still differences. This is an important step in the implementation phase of the Minsk agreements and following the decision of the leaders of the member countries of the Normandy Quartet during their meeting in Paris in December 2019. We hope that in the future a ceasefire will be maintained, which will make it possible to resolve other problems in the Ukrainian conflict more effectively, especially those of a political nature. This is Russia's position, but we could see earlier what a part of Ukraine was saying, and also that part of the population. They said that they did not trust these ceasefires, and that supposedly it was Russia that was encouraging these ceasefire violations. But they don't show any documents to prove that it's Russia that's violating the ceasefire, and then creating this imaginary enemy. Then the Ukrainian troops say they have to defend themselves. And all this takes place in the midst of agreements endorsed by the so-called Normandy Quartet, Who are the members of this alliance? When, where, and why was it created? Let's review. The Normandy Quartet is a diplomatic group composed of high-level representatives from France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine, which aims to find a solution to the war conflict in eastern Ukraine. It operates mainly through telephone calls between the presidents of the member countries and their respective foreign ministers. The group was created on June 6, 2014, when its members held a meeting at the Château de Venouville in the French region of Normandy, from which it derivates its name. One of their most significant agreements was the Minsk II, during the third meeting they held between February 11 and 12, 2015 in the capital. Representatives of Russia and Ukraine, along with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, established a document composed of 12 points, which promised to bring the desired peace. Ceasefire in certain districts of the Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk, removal of all heavy weapons from both sides at equal distances, with the aim of creating a safety zone of at least 50 kilometers. Initiate dialogue for conducting local elections in accordance with Ukrainian law. Adoption by the Ukrainian parliament of a resolution on the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk under special regime. Provide pardon and amnesty to the persons involved in the events in Donetsk and Lugansk. To proceed with the release and exchange of all prisoners and detainees illegally held. To provide access, delivery, storage, and distribution of humanitarian aid to those in need through an international mechanism. Define the modalities for the full restoration of social and economic relations, including social transfers such as pension payments. To restore to the Ukrainian government control of the state border in the entire conflict zone. To elaborate the constitutional reform in Ukraine, which would come into force by the end of 2015. To discuss the issues related to the local elections with the representatives of the particular districts of the Donetsk and Lugansk within the framework of the Trilateral Contact Group. To intensify the work of the Trilateral Contact Group through the establishment of working groups to implement the Minsk agreements. These measures adopted by the Normandy Quartet were extended until 2016 and then reaffirmed at this year's December summit in Paris. In that context, the leaders assured that the mentioned agreements remain the basis for the multilateral format and reiterated their attachment to the cessation of hostilities in Donbass. It is important, always. So let's geospatially locate this Ukrainian region, scene of this war conflict that broke out in 2014. Donbass, the keys to a conflict. Donbass, a word formed from the phrase Donetsk Basin or Donetsk Basin, refers to the river that flows through the historical, cultural, and economic region located to the east of Ukraine and close to Russia, both countries of the Eurasian continent. The boundaries of the area have never been officially defined, but it includes the Donetsk and Lugansk of Ukraine, as well as the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and southern Russia. Donbass was the historical border between the siege of Zaporizhzhia and the host of Donbass. Since the time of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian speakers have remained in the plural districts of the area until today, while in the cities, many are Russian speakers with strong ties to the neighboring country. To give you an idea, by 2001, 74.9% of the population in the Donetsk Oblast spoke Russian, and only 24.1% spoke Ukrainian. The Donetsk Basin has been an important coal mining area since the end of the 19th century, when the territory was industrialized. The economy of the area is dominated by coal mining and the metallurgical industry, despite the fact that annual coal extraction has decreased since the 90s and 70s. Donbass is still an important supplier. The extraction of lignite is carried out in about 600 meters below the surface, while the mining of anthracite and Ola Budimosa coal is carried out at about 1,800 meters deep. In March 2014, in the wake of the so-called Euromaidan, large parts of Donbass were involved in socio-political disturbances that laid the basis for a dispute between a pro-Russian independence movement affiliated with the self-proclaimed People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, and the so-called post-revolutionary government of Ukraine, supported by the West. Until the beginning of the ongoing conflict, Donbass was the most populated region of Ukraine, besides Kiev, its capital. I invite you to check some digital information. Let's check what Sputnik has published on July 30. Moscow calls on EU to pay attention to Kiev's inhuman actions towards the Crimea. The European Union should pay attention to the fact that Ukraine has cut off the supply of water and electricity to Crimea, declared the deputy spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Alexei Saites. The diplomat said that the violations of international law, of which the EU bloc is against accusing Russia, are exactly what Moscow is evidencing on part of the authorities in Kiev. In this regard, instead of relying on founded accusations by Ukraine against Russia, we propose that the EU pay due attention to Kiev's inhuman actions in cutting off water and electricity supplies to the Crimea. Saites told the press. He also addressed the European Commission, which on July 28 described the construction of amphibious assault ships in the city of Kerch as testimony to Russia's militarization of the Crimea, which is capable of affecting security in the Black Sea region. We see it as a new attempt to interfere in the internal affairs of another state. Saites described the Brussels Declaration as an inability to seriously evaluate the realities of the region, as well as a way of showing indifference towards the interests and legitimate aspirations of the Crimean people. He stressed that Russia, by strengthening its navy, seeks to ensure stability and security in the Crimea. He also recalled that the countries of the EU bloc refused to issue Schengen visas to Crimean residents with passports obtained after 2014. We propose the EU to abandon visa discrimination for the inhabitants of Crimea, which directly contradicts the rules of international law and the fundamental documents of the EU itself. The Crimea broke away from Ukraine and rejoined Russia after a referendum in March 2014, in which an overwhelming majority of voters, more than 96%, endorsed that option. The Ukrainian authorities consider the Crimea to be a temporarily occupied territory. Moscow has repeatedly stated that inhabitants of the Crimea, in a democratic manner and in full compliance with international law and the UN Charter, voted in favor of reunification with Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that the issue of the Crimea is definitively settled. And in this context, I'd like to suggest you the reading of an article titled Ukraine's Most Strange Peace Pipe in Donbass, written by Antonio Rondon and published on the digital site of the Latin Press Agency on August 3rd. I'll read some of its paragraphs. The end of the conflict in the Donbass coalfield is the focus of 6 years of effort, during which Kiev tried to change the composition of those who came to the negotiating table with the intention of involving Russia. Perhaps the Ukrainian political scientist Mikhail Gonchar offered the most modern version of those in Ukraine who made the war in Donbass an avenue of enrichment bordering on illegality. Gonchar referring to the establishment of the 22nd ceasefire in Donbass, which has been in place since July 27th, considered that it puts Kiev in a dilemma as it clearly consolidates Russia's position as a mediator in the dispute, in contradiction to Ukrainian legislation. Some might describe the truce reached as of 27 July as something transcendental, not so much because of the intention of its faithful fulfillment, above all on the part of Ukraine, but because of the mechanism established, at least on paper, to exercise control over it, beyond the traditional agreement to remove heavy weaponry from the line of confrontation. It also prohibits the carrying out of any type of exploration and offensive activity. In case of any recorded war activity, the tripartite contact group formed by Ukraine, the rebel representatives, and Russia must be notified immediately. The ceasefire from the military point of view has many cracks, as it is almost certain that the guns will ring. but at least there are days of peace for the inhabitants of the areas near the border established in Donetsk and Lugansk between rebels and the Ukrainian government. In addition, the scheme of calling for peace is repeated without dispelling the myth of Russian aggression, according to local media. Zelensky seemed to consume his popularity by registering less than 30% acceptance after his policy towards Donbass, and Russia hardly changed in a little more than a year of government. As some Russian political scientists claim, Ukraine became a hostage of a minority that never won at the polls. Ultranationalists threatened to repeat the 2014 protests that ended in a coup if there is any proximity to Moscow. Ukraine, in 30 years of independent life after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, far from gaining sovereignty, it seems to be losing it. This can be seen, for example, in the recordings of the telephone conversations between Poroshenko and the former American Vice President Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential candidate for the coming November elections. Let's update more information with our correspondent Lisandra Andres from Moscow. Thank you very much, Ray. It's always so nice to say hello. The end of the conflict in the Donbass area has been the focus of efforts for 6 years now, during which Kiev has maintained and tried to vary the composition of those who come to the negotiation table, always with the intention of involving Russia in this process. Some politologists believe that this war has been a path of enrichment that borders on illegally for many of Ukraine, and therefore the ceasefire of July 27th is important to clarify that it is the 22nd decree since the conflict began. It puts Kiev in a dilemma as it consolidates Russia's mediating position in this conflict, in contradiction to the Ukrainian legislation. In the year 2018, the unicameral parliament took upon itself the task of placing Russia as the aggressor nation and the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Lugansk in the Donbass area as temporarily occupied territories. According to specialists, this indicates that Moscow, by acting as a mediator in this process, is coming out of its condition of aggressor, while it turns the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk into real interlocutors with a voice in the conversations. All of this contradicts the version that Kiev has been handling. In fact, the September Protocol of 2014 and the package of measures that were later agreed in February of 2015 in Minsk to introduce combat action with Ukrainian troops were at point where their suffering defeats on the ground recognized that Donetsk and Lugansk rebels as real interlocutors. Moscow, by demanding compliance with all the packages of measures approved in Minsk and denying any participation of their troops in this process of confrontation, is trying to make Ukraine leave aside the unjustified arguments that it presents mainly as the main pretext for demanding sanctions against Russia from the West, the application of measures against this country. Therefore, this truce agreed on July 27th, which according to several media has already been violated by the Ukrainian side, has been described by some specialists as transcendental, not so much because of the real intentions that exist for its fulfillment, but because of all the mechanisms that it establishes to guarantee that it is carried out. This is all the information. Back to you in the studio. Thank you so much, Lisandra. Let's take our first break in our critical move. Remember, there is a strategic move in social media for you to participate. Kiev troops shooting. Who are moving the pieces so peace cannot be reached in the east of Ukraine? Who is encouraging this stabilization? Leave your opinion. Let's take a break. We'll be back soon. How far back does the conflict at Donbass go? Let's make it short timeline. The origins of this conflict can be traced to the early 90s of last century. In 1991, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk regions has asked the Russian president Boris Yeltsin to keep them as part of Russia and not to hand them over to Ukraine, as revealed by the head of the presidential administration for the time, Sergei Filatov. In February 2018, former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, signed the so-called Donbass reintegration law. The law accused Russia of being an aggressor state and created the joint headquarters of the Ukrainian military to attack the self-styled independence republics of Donbass and Lugansk, which did not recognize Poroshenko. The president had assumed office after a coup against President Viktor Yanukovych in 2014 during the European protest called Euromaidan. In March of that year, demonstrations against the Kiev government emerged, which triggered an armed confrontation that UN estimates at 13,000 deaths. On June 6, the highest representatives of Ukraine, Russia, Germany and France met for the first time to find a political solution to the conflict in Donbass. From there arises the so-called Normandy Quartet, which operates mainly through telephone calls between the four rulers and their respective foreign ministers. They met again on 16 and 17 October in Milan, Italy, and from 11 to 12 February 2015 in Minsk, in which context the so-called Minsk Agreement was signed. In July of that same year, it was announced that 2,000 troops from 18 countries were participating in Kiev military maneuvers launched by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In April 2019, President Vladimir Putin issued a decree for the inhabitants of the Donbass to acquire Russian citizenship. The aim was to facilitate their passage to Russian territory for humanitarian reasons. In December, the Normandy Quartet planned another meeting to follow up on agreements. The outbreak of the pandemic has prevented the new meeting from taking place. On July 27th, the senior commanders of the troops issued an order on compliance with the ceasefire regime along the line of confrontation. In a telephone conversation, the presidents of Russia and Ukraine welcomed an additional measures that have made the new truce possible. There's a little clarification. In images we were watching Poroshenko, but who recently dialogued with Vladimir Putin is the current president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. So we start the analysis. We have from Mexico, Dr. Ernesto Carmona, expert in international relations, professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and from Venezuela, Martin Pulgar, politologist and magister in philosophy of war. Welcome both of you to our critical move. Martin, if you allow me, I'd like to start with Ernesto. How to understand that a newly adopted truce between the parties to the Donbass is violated again? What is the response to this violation? Hello, how are you? Thank you so much for inviting me. I think that the agreements that have been held to be able to accomplish peace, well, they are very weak and they have been constantly violated. We saw the agreement of Minsk. They had to deal with Ukraine and Russia reached some agreements, and from that point on, practically nothing has been accomplished of what they agreed back in that 2014. Now we have seen some improvements. Well, let's keep on talking with Martin. It seems like we lost connection with Ernesto. So, Martin, I ask you the very same question. So, following the previous conversation, there are very weak agreements. Practically, there has been any deep any belief of this will last, involving different actors who participate in this. Of course, there are some negotiations that are held among countries and groups and actors on the ground. But this decree is violated constantly, and these truths are for improve a little bit its negotiative skills and these agreements that elites build as they negotiate with it. So there are two very important factors: the states who are involved and the countries who are involved, and actors in the ground, and in this case, of course, Ukrainians. And there are the groups that they call pro-Russian, but at the end they are an ethnic identity and who pretends to be, because we cannot forget all that it was, the persecution of this pro-Russian ethnic during the Maidan coup, who practically assumed a defensive action. So for Western and for national press, it's easy to say pro-Russian, but on the ground there is a very important consideration, which is resistance of them as an ethnic group and as a social group who feels and who suffer persecution for nationalists with sometimes neo-Nazi characteristic. So this truth in the search of negotiation is more favorable for different groups, but also because sometimes there are exiled. And these social groups on the ground, and they're only argued from the point of view of elite. Sometimes there are exiled. And these social groups on the ground, and they're only argued from the point of view of elites, who are the ones who sit and negotiate. Thank you, Martin. Ernesto, we re-established communication with you. I was actually talking about this reflection that Martin complemented for us. Why this new truth has been broken. And we see that there is a conflict here between different groups. Martin even spoke of the case of what the West calls pro-Russians, who are an important ethnic group, an important social group in eastern Ukraine, and also draws my attention in this context. When reading the recommendation text, the author referred to how there are ultra-nationalist elements that are practically the ones that are trying to keep this conflict alive, so that peace in the Ukrainian East is not consolidated. But this is also going through a very difficult and complex moment, and it is election year in the United States. The current candidate for the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, has been said to be a faithful ally of the government authorities in Ukraine. What do you think about this? Yes, of course, and we also must add the matter of the pandemic and the situation, this difficult situation you were talking about. But I think that, yes, the conflict in Ukraine, it will keep encouraged by alliances that exist. In the United States, from the Democratic Party side, who has been revealed, and we see the support they have received in the past from the Democratic administration of Barack Obama. So I think it is very important, and there is a strategic here. I think it is a very important strategic to worsen the conflict, not to solve it, because Ukraine wouldn't, in fact, it haven't said in any dialogue that could maintain a straight dialogue with territories that have proclaimed their independence. So they talked with Russia, they don't talk straight with the groups in those territories. And not even with rebel groups, rebel forces. So, regarding this issue, I think it could become something more according as time goes by. Let's remember there is accusation from the Democratic candidate. There was a conflict of interest from a company from his son, Joe Biden. If this gets worsened and the conflict reaches higher levels and an agreement is reached out, this could affect directly the Democratic campaign, which is more obvious by the time. So it is important, maybe right now, for the Democrats to incentivize that Ukraine may reach any agreement, fulfill any agreement. But obviously, as you say, there are some ultranationalist groups who are not agreed because they are feeding a very strong nationalism. And all of these groups have been growing up in most of the European territory, and they're going to represent a very strong challenge to obtain a peace agreement. And as time goes by and they get stronger, well, they're going to play a most important role in this conflict. So these groups are not interested in the construction of this peace, but it's very probable that Ukrainian government may want something for the moment, maybe to reach some agreement. At some point, happened with the Islamic State in Syria and in other nations in the world. These groups that are useful at some point, but for the political negotiations, they're not useful. But they have encouraged their own agenda, and they have been fed by speeches by the powers, and they also can to forget about the plans of the conflict parts. Of course, looking at the very marked differences between the self-called Islamic State and the rebels in the eastern Ukraine. Thank you. Martin, starting from what Ernesto just said on the position of the current Ukrainian government, it is important to analyze for a couple of minutes the position of President Vladimir Zelensky, who on one hand says that Ukraine is indivisible. However, he dialogues with President Putin to see if a peace agreement will be reached in the Ukrainian east. I think that the division of Ukraine has not been what has been seen as some sort of autonomy that in these regions, let's say the east of Ukraine would grant, of course, many of the actors who are participating in this category, which is very bad, those pro-Russian, who at the end are nothing more than an important ethnical group when it comes to culture. And so any of them would describe would prefer an integration by Russia, but others would prefer an autonomy inside Ukraine, which would be the most good when it comes to a negotiable agreement from both sides. There are still two sides from the Republic of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Republic, with the great autonomy. So this possible solution of autonomy or autonomy for these regions is not well seen for some nationalist groups who are truly. These Ukrainian groups are not very different from their practices in respect to other radical groups. They are like very involved with the hatred to Russia, very commitment with the extermination of these Russian ethnic groups in Ukraine. But what is in risk is the kind of negotiable agreement and the kind of autonomy these regions would have. Of course, if Ukraine, you give autonomy to these regions or these areas of Ukraine, they could also demand this kind of autonomy. And for the Ukrainian projects, This could be the beginning of a separation of the Ukrainian state, and to have two states inside one, with a Russian ethnic identification and other one with more European characteristics. And these things are not very useful, but we see and are important when it comes to journalistic terms. So geographically it's established that these areas are in conflict. What is going on? That there is a very important space where the United States and the internal confrontation of the United States plays a very important role also in the global area. And the confrontation with Russia, China, it's our Ukrainian scenario is not very different from those, or Hong Kong itself, or China. With in this case, it's just a confrontation with Russia to control and to create conflicts and make more conflict in the scenario, in this case Russia, and of course China too. But there's also another way to bring the conflict. Not so long ago they went through Azerbaijan and Armenia. There was a conflict and a confrontation in the global geopolitical board. We have seen this even in the origin and resolutions. So we can see there is a dark hand who has been generating confrontations. So in the American electoral scenario, we can see this. Thank you, Martin. He was differentiating in between the Islamic State and the non-ultranationalists of Ukraine, but with the rebels of the east of the Ukraine. So when we talk about ultra-nationalism with other elements come into play that allow for some similarities with these terrorist groups that have operated in Middle East nations over the last 5 years, above all. Thank you so much, Martin, and also Dr. Ernesto, for your time for that critical move. Thank you. Let's take another break, and when we're back, we will continue to analyzing this conflict. So we will go a little bit deep inside of it. So there is a strategic move. Remember, you can participate along with those. Today is after the agreement of ceasefire in Donbass. Russia is shooting. Who is moving pieces for peace cannot be carried out in Ukraine? Who is encouraging it? Give us your opinion. We'll be back soon. Since we have put this issue on the geopolitical board, I'm sure you're wondering, how is Ukraine seen both regionally and globally? Let's review. Ukraine is of vital importance at the strategic level. Historically, Ukraine was considered the Soviet granary. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became a major grain exporter to Russia, the European Union, and part of the Middle East. Its present boundaries were first shaped by its ceasing to be a Soviet republic in the 90s. Because of the still recent fact, it is very difficult to build a common history and identity. So the country is culturally divided between the eastern and western regions. After its exit from the Soviet bloc, it seemed that it would maintain strong economic and cultural ties with Russia, led by President Leonid Kuchma. However, there were tensions over border issues. Due to its geographical location, Ukraine has served as a gateway for Russian gas to Europe, but there have been tough negotiations between the two countries. For Vladimir Putin's executive, the economic conditions posed by Kiev are unacceptable. In the face of the Ukrainian government's turn ground, Moscow began to take measures that included trade blockades and raising the value of gas. However, the official in charge of energy policy assured that the Kremlin will continue to supply energy to the European subcontinent after 2020, when the contract with the Ukrainian authorities ends. In 2004, there was an electoral crisis that led to a second round of presidential. The winner was Viktor Yushchenko, who proposed that the country join as a member of NATO and the European Union. His foreign policy provoked a reaction from society that saw his will mocked by the holding of second elections. During the government of Piotr Poroshenko, after the Euromaidan that caused the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, Kiev turned decisively to the Atlantic Alliance, arguing that it was the only thing that would armor it from the alleged Russian invasion, now listed as NATO's partner country. The Ukrainian crisis revived Cold War-era tensions with Russia. Moscow has announced the interest of the West and NATO to encircle it politically and militarily, while Kiev attributes the outbreak of conflict in Donbass to the Kremlin. By demanding compliance with the Minsk agreements and denying participation of its troops in the confrontation, Russia seeks to make Ukraine put aside the unjustified arguments it presents as a pretext for demanding sanctions against the Slavic giant from the West. We continue with the analysis in our critical move. We have from San Sebastián, Iñaki Gil de San Vicente, intellectual. It's a pleasure to have you with us one more time. Well, we put back on the geopolitical board the conflict in Donbass, a conflict that is still far from being resolved, with the ceasefire violations that have been agreed upon, but it's been violated by the Kiev side, the same side that says they are the victim and not the perpetrator. Yes, it's really far away if someday they can achieve peace among the communities who live there and they can develop within a legal and stable framework. It is very hard, because politically there is a reason, but there is one reason, and that is that for the sector, or sectors that now are ruling in the Western economy, to these two sectors, Ukraine has a very importance. There is no future or analyst that don't see that predict a very hard and horrible situation in the world. And there is a vision that a little bit apocalyptic, but great services of intelligence in many states analyze the reality with 25-30 years ahead, and there are many variables to be able to intervene. There is also very interesting the question of carbon, and there's also they are very interested. Also, Russia is interested, and in this European sector, it has two parts. One, which is the most hard and savage, is the one that is using fascism in Ukraine. Fascism that is not, it does not come from now. There have been already a fascist movement since World War II. That it was directed by Stepan Bandera, who was a very armed executor from Nazis against the Poles who were escaping Poland and trying to refugee in Ukraine, but also against guerrillas, popular guerrillas, communist popular guerrillas, who were preparing the Red Army. So they kept active, even militarily, even to the 1956 year when they carried out their last action, and these actions were kept and preserved to be reactivated again later that by the NATO and its secrets. So, of course, they don't want a minimal agreement with Russia. So anytime they have a chance, they boycott all the chances. So in order to accept the agreements of Minsk, they did it because they just lost the first part of war. And if Minsk's two wars were held, it's because they lost the popular arm of Donbass in that area. And Russia played a poor role because it didn't still have a political. Russia was preparing a lot of stuff and played a nuclear policy that it turned out to be very good. And there is another sector, which is the sector with some characteristics from Germany and sectors of France, etc., who wants to wait for more time. And we see as the way Trump do these things when it comes to these very serious matters such as the coronavirus, the Brexit, matters such as the British economical situation. Several problems at the same time is facing the European Union, which in the head of France and Germany is trying to mediate also in this conflict. But there is something that I would like to talk to me about. It has to do with the loss of the war in 2015 by the Western powers. Are you, by any chance, referring to how NATO lost ground with the sum of Crimea to the Russian Federation? I'm referring to three matters. There could be more, but I'm going to try to talk very briefly about three. First, there is a strategic, because it separates the Red Sea from the Black Sea, and we know that for intention from the United States to get the ocean. So they lost it. Another question is that what has to do with the decision of Donbass, which is very organized. And there is also another matter that later than that has been proved that the communication system of the Russian army back then was not detected by any electronic system from the NATO. So the Donbass was carried out, of course, with the support of Russia. It was with the electronic sigil. And since then, the United States and NATO have tried to figure out how that happened. So for these two reasons, NATO realized that they have a very powerful enemy right in front of it, with the demonstration of Russian capacity to move troops, that they didn't see that coming. So they have no other chance but to reach this agreement, the Minsk. But Putin accepted. We can never forget, and especially in this moment, the importance of the military strategy and how the services, the European services and from North America, they know that they are facing a power, in this case Russia, China, Iran, a power that in the most critical powers increases, and back in that moment they have to hold back because they show a very high Russian technology. Thank you so much for this reflection for our critical move today. See you soon. Let's go to conclusions. Between meetings of the Normandy Quartet and ceasefire violations of Kiev, the ups and downs of the still conflicting Donbass flow, there are lines of the Minsk agreements that have not materialized, among other reasons because the future for the inhabitants of that area, who are ethnically Ukrainian but culturally Russian, is not yet clear. Crimea has already decided its path, and it is a wound that NATO is unable to heal. What is missing to make the situation in Donetsk and Lugansk honest through democratic means? Will that goal be achieved by Volodymyr Zelensky, more open to dialogue with Russia than Petro Poroshenko? France and Germany, at the end of this Europe hard hit by the pandemic, do not lose sight of the issue, since the economic stability of the community bloc also goes through peace in Donbass. Therefore, keeping the ceasefire is still a word of order. For today, we close the geopolitical board.